Let's talk about our ecological footprint. So, with the beginning of the industrialization in the 70s, the consumption of humanity rose steadily. So, more and more resources back then were used as the nature was able to regenerate. Consequently, researchers evolved a concept to screen the usage of environmental resources, so the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint is basically, a tool measuring how much productive land and water an individual, so a single person, a city, a country, or humanity in total requires to produce the resources it consumes and to absorb the waste it generates using prevailing technology. So, long definition, right? In short terms, with this concept, you get a better overview what size of land is necessary in order to provide the current living standards. So afterwards, this land is compared to what land is available, and in the end, conclusions can be drawn whether humanity is acting sustainable or not. The land, or so-called biocapacity, contains every part of environment, which is economically usable, like grazing or cropland, for example, energy or built-up land, fishing ground, and also forests. It represents the biologically productive area that provides renewable biological capacity, including the replenishment of resources and the absorption of waste, such as carbon dioxide, for example, from burning fossil fuels. Our cities or infrastructures, for example, are considered within the term built-up land, while agricultural area or animal breeding referred to crop or grazing land. The unit in which this biocapacity is measured is called global hectare. To enable the comparability of areas between different countries, the global hectare represents an average unit to take different soils, fertilities, and the associated productivity into account. So you have probably heard dozens of times that humanity's current consumption excels the biocapacity. So that's a very common thing to say. According to current studies, our ecological footprints do not guarantee nature's recoverability. But what are exactly the reasons? So in general, you can say that further the development of a country in economic terms, the higher is the ecological footprint. So thus, the called third world countries have a lower footprint as industrialized nations. What size do you think should an average footprint have to maintain sustainability? So originally, a footprint smaller than 1.6 global hectares is considered to be sustainable. But in average, a human leaves a footprint of 2.7 global hectares behind. So we consume more than nature is able to regenerate. The world map you see on the slide gives you a comparison between all countries. So you mainly can recognize two different groups of countries here. We have countries with a larger footprint and countries with a smaller one, obviously. So developed countries with an above average consumption are drawn red and usually run a biocapacity deficit due to their high consumption. In contrast to that, countries with a blue filling usually represent developing countries. Their region's biocapacity often exceeds their footprint, what makes them a biocapacity reserve. As we already mentioned, there is a tendency of Europe, North America and China having a biocapacity deficit, and some parts of South America as well as Asia and Africa being a biocapacity reserve. So the diagram on the right hand side picks up how many Earths would be necessary according to the lifestyles of these countries. Before we go into detail, I want to mention that this diagram does not show the exact order, but points the most important economic nations out. While countries like Australia, USA, and South Korea are raising the average, India and Africa lower the average, for example. So the world's inhabitants need in sum 1.7 Earths. So the fact that we use resources in 1 year, the Earth can only regenerate in 1 year and 8 months. should give you a better imagination of our impact, right? So that this development is not sustainable shouldn't be surprising. Well, we have seen that not every country contributes to the consumption of scarce resources at the same level. So we found out that there definitely is a correlation between prosperity with this associated consumption and the size of the ecological footprint. So the following dot diagram picks up this point and shows clearly that the interrelationship between the level of a country's development and its consumed earths. So the Human Development Index, which is shown on the horizontal axis, takes the gross national income as well as the education and the life expectancy into consideration and evaluates every country. Going along the development axis, you find African and some Eastern Asian countries at first. On the one hand, their lower level of prosperity doesn't give them the opportunity to live a wasteful lifestyle. On the other hand, infrastructure isn't that much developed, which has, for instance, lower carbon dioxide emissions as a consequence. So if we continue our path along the development axis, we encounter high developed countries next. This place is basically filled with Central American, Middle Eastern or Asian countries, which left their status of being a developing countries and recently belong to emerging countries. The position of the points has moved up and the consumption went over the world's limits since prosperity and wealth have been increasing. Looking at the very high human development sector, we see that the needed earths of these countries according to the consumption far exceeds world's biocapacity. The high level of prosperity and the associated capabilities of spending money into more goods substantiate the position of these points. Finally, we can say that the higher the level of development, the bigger the consumption and the ecological footprint. So, taking a closer look to the statistic of Germany, the numbers underline the red color. In every year along the timeline, Germany's ecological footprint was higher than its biocapacity. Although the ecological footprint among Germany's population was reducing the last year, Germany still has a footprint of 4.8 global hectare per person. So this size is 3 times bigger than the nature allows us. If we now investigate how the ecological footprint makes up, we can divide the influencing factors into 4 groups. So group 1, the nutrition, makes up 1/3 of the whole footprint. As performed studies show, animal products leave the bigger ecological footprint and are responsible for 77% of the nutrition's impact. The reason for this number is the bigger amount of resources being necessary for animal products in comparison to plant-based products. So the substitution of ecologic and critical products with environmental friendlier alternatives can decrease the footprint by 26%. Secondly, living makes an essential part of the footprint with 25%. So particularly heating and energy consumption influence this part the most. The last 2 groups, mobility and consumption, complete the footprint with 22 and 18% here. So next to the wave of high emission means of transport, the purchase of second-hand products can improve the footprint at this point. As a result of these 2 statistics, we can sum it up and say that politics and society should adapt to a more sustainable lifestyle in these 4 areas to prevent the exploitation of nature. In the end, we take a closer look on the calculation of the ecological footprint. So the extent of the consumption results from 2 components, the production of a country and the balance of the imports/exports. The production is the sum of all bioproductive areas within a country which are necessary for supporting the actual harvest, enabling the country's built-up areas and absorbing all fossil fuel carbon emissions generated within the country. At this point, cropland, grazing lands as well as fishing grounds represent examples for harvesting areas, and roads, factories and cities are contained in built-up areas. That means that every area which is used to enable the prosperity of a country is included in the quantity production. Further, the net ecological footprint of trade represents the second part. This quantity is made up of the ecological footprint of imports minus the ecological footprint of exports. If the ecological footprint embodied in exports is higher than that of imports, then a country is a creditor of renewable resources and ecological services. Consequently, the country is a debtor of renewable resources and ecological services in the other case. Once the production and the net ecological footprint of trade have been recorded, they are converted into global hectare to calculate the country's actual footprint. Germany, for instance, has an ecological footprint per person of 4.8 global hectare, as we have already mentioned before.